Good morning, everyone. Thank y'all for being here on this rainy morning to celebrate our dear friend, Walt Cunningham. I'm Melissa Jacobs, and for a decade, I covered Return to Flight and the end of the Space Shuttle program for Fox News Channel. But full disclosure, and most importantly, for the last 20 years, Dot Cunningham has been the most dear friend to me in the whole world. So I'm told that Walt wanted this to be fun and laugh. And so that's what we're going to hope to do today as we remember our friend. You guys knew him much in a different way than all of us earthbound people could. So I think what we'll do is I will introduce you, and then you can just tell us what you remember about Walt. You know, last night I heard some fabulous stories, one of which someone called Walt a force. And I heard another great story of someone who had met Walt and knew him for 6 months, never mentioned he was an astronaut. So finally one day he said, you know, I hear you flew with Wally Schirra. And Walt says, well, I prefer to think Wally flew with me. So as aviators, I'm sure you all can relate to that. We'll start with the Apollo program, and then we'll move up. So on our end here is George Abbey. George was an Air Force pilot and went on to become the director of the Johnson Space Center, and he is and was the champion of the space station and is widely known as the maker of astronauts. George, tell us about your friend Walt.
Well, it's very good to be here and be at a service remembering the contributions that Walt made to the space program. I met Walt some 60 years ago when he came to Houston, and worked with him very closely at very many design reviews and acceptance testing of the spacecraft, as he was assigned to the backup crew to Apollo 1. And I ended up working closely with the prime crew of Apollo 1 and also the backup crew, Wally Schirra, and Don Isley and Walt Cunningham, and spent a good bit of time with him. And they, at that time, were involved with reviewing all the design changes that we were making to that spacecraft that was going to fly in February of 1967. And then after the tragedy, Wally and Don and Walt got assigned as the prime crew for the first manned mission, Apollo 7. And we, of course, had to find the cause of the problem after the fire and make a lot of design changes that ended up giving us a much better spacecraft. And Wally and Walt and Don were involved in defining all those changes, and also involved in determining the acceptability of those changes. And it was a very exciting time, but a time of great apprehension, because at that point in time, because of the fire, we looked like we were not going to make our goal of making the landing by the end of the decade. And I was working for George Lowe, the program manager, and in August of '68, George Lowe came up with a plan that would have us making the landing by the end of the decade, but it was all predicated on the flight of Apollo 7 occurring in October of '68, and that flight being a completely successful flight. And if we were successful on that flight, 2 months later we were going to go back to the moon, go to the moon on Apollo 8 with a command module unmanned and without a lunar module, and then be able to go on to the next step with a lunar module on Apollo 9, and then subsequently a dress rehearsal for the landing on Apollo 10 and the Apollo 11 landing in July. And those missions were occurring every 2 months, but that was all predicated on Apollo 7 being successful. And so the changes that we incorporated after the fire had to really be defined and then put into the spacecraft, and then Wally and Walt and Don really evaluated the acceptability of all those changes. And we had many discussions about those changes and their acceptability, and finally defined what we were going to do and did it. And Wally and Don and Walt were involved in the acceptance of that spacecraft and the subsequent flight in October 1968. And the first flight of a new spacecraft is always a critical mission, and it's even more critical when it's manned. And it takes a crew of great capability and courage to take on that kind of a job and do it well. And Wally and Walt and Don did that. And it proved to be a very successful mission, and it was the key to being able to proceed, because the next mission, Apollo 8, was all predicated on the acceptability of Apollo 7. And Jim Webb, who was the administrator of NASA, didn't give us approval to go on do that Apollo 8 mission until after Apollo 7. We determined that the mission was indeed successful. So if you look at the contribution that Walt and his teammates made on Apollo 7, it was really the key to allowing us to make the lunar landing that we made in July of 1969. And it wouldn't have occurred without the success of that mission. There were a lot of people that worked on that mission, but it took a great crew and a very courageous crew to really accomplish it. And they did it and did it well. It had a number of firsts, and one of the firsts was, it was our first mission of television, where we had television from the spacecraft, and we could see the astronauts as they worked and did their activities in space. But it was not like what we see from the space station today, which is a high definition color TV. It was black and white and pretty grainy, but it was really a major step forward for us at that time. And it turned out to be a great mission, and I will always have memories of Walt and his crew of flying that flight and the contributions they made to making us successful in landing on the moon. There were great times, and Walt was a major participant in making it all happen. And I was very fortunate to be able to be a part of it and to know Walt and work with him.
Thank you so much. We're gonna have sore hands by the end. But let's move to Fred Haise. Fred, also a Marine Corps pilot, and flew Apollo 13. And it seems like in recent years, you and Walt were the Batman and Robin you did so much with Be an Angel and for the children. Tell us a little bit about your friend.
First, I might tell you about an experience the first time I ever met Walt. And then I can talk a little bit about Be an Angel charity. I was a rookie. We were original 19, as Charlie was too. And the crew preparing to fly Apollo 7 was spending all their time pretty much at the Cape. At the same time, I was, for 14 months, was up at the Grumman plant in New York, working to get lunar modules ready to ship to the Cape. But I had occasion to have one meeting down at the Cape to discuss modifications we had to make to a chamber for an upcoming chamber test of the first lunar module, getting ready for flight. And on the way to leaving to fly back to New York and Grumman plant, I stopped by crew quarters just to say hello to the staff there before I headed out. And there sat the Apollo 7 crew. I didn't expect to see them. They were sitting there, all three of them. And I had my hanging bag over my back and helmet bag carrying it, and a coat bag over my back. And Wally actually was the one that led the come on, and there was a cage sitting there, and you could see in it a little furry-looking thing in there. And Wally talked about how somebody had brought them this animal for good luck or something. And of course, I was looking at it, and I got over to the cage a little closer to look at it. And about that time, they had some remote control. and the front opened, and this furry critter leapt out at me, this furry thing. And I'm now beating it with my hanging bag, this furry, not alive critter. So they had big yuck. So that was the first time really face-to-face I met Walt. Was a little gotcha there in crew quarters at Kennedy. But at any rate, I did get to work with Walt a lot after we both left the program here in Houston with the Be an Angel charity, which is a great charity for handicapped children. And we had occasion to deliver Christmas presents. It's a tremendous logistics operation they do to, first of all, get the presents picked for all handicapped children across Houston, which is obviously very large. And I was not involved, Walt, with the hard work of really picking out the presents and wrapping them and getting them ready, but then put in piles in the back area where the exhibits were brought in at the big casino convention center here in Houston, where you could drive your car up into there, and we would drive through and pick up loads. I had at that time a Honda station wagon and did not have a GPS, so we had to do it old school with a map to find the schools. But we'd make about three or four trips, and I'd make a final one to get back to Pasadena area, in that area I lived, to deliver some. But Walt always had this cup of coffee, and he was every day he would go by a McDonald's. I guess it was close to where he lived, and get this free cup of coffee. Now it turns out there was some deal that McDonald's offered to give you free coffee, but I think it was for just a month or a few months. But Walt had conned the manager, and maybe several managers, into that it was a lifetime award. So Walt always had his coffee cup filled for us to make these trips around mostly the west side of Houston, delivering packages to schools. Walton also were always an item to auction at the annual gala for a dinner with a personage that one is on the out and one is for the prize. And we convinced, at least I thought they were happy to take two Marines who they figured by now their wives had given them enough culture to use utensils at dinner. So we did that every year for the organization.
Thank you. Thank you. What was Walt's call sign? Does anybody know? I couldn't remember that. Charlie Duke was an Air Force test pilot and flew Apollo 16. Tell us a Walt story.
Fred and I were in the same group we called it the Original 19. And of course, we met all the astronauts when we first arrived. And Walt was one of them. And I never worked with Walt in the early days of Apollo. I was doing other things, and so we weren't intimately involved I wasn't anyway, with what Walt was doing with Apollo 7. But after Apollo 7, I think George Abbey related the success of that mission. And it was so successful that 2 months later, NASA committed Apollo 8 to the moon without any backup. It's the first time a crew had flown in a Saturn V, the first crew Saturn V, and we launched them to the moon with no backup because of the confidence that we had in the work that Apollo 7 did. It was tremendous. I thought it was the most risky mission that NASA ever flew, because they on the way to the moon, baby, they don't have any backup. It's got to work. And the crew was ready to accept that risk. So my involvement with Walt came later on, after we both left the space program. We got involved in various activities of just going around and ended up with a guy named Tom Coleman who does the American Pavilion for all the big air shows around the world. And so Walt and I were involved in a number of those events with Dot, and so it was really exciting for me to get to know Walt at that point. We both left the program, but we were both involved in sharing the story of Apollo. And so, Dot, I want to thank you for including me in this panel. He was a great friend, a great mentor, and a great spokesman for NASA throughout the years. And really miss him. We had a Paris Air Show a few years ago that my wife and Dot and Walt were involved in, and we got to meet a number of wonderful people and to represent the U.S. And Walt was a great representative and a great spokesman for NASA. And so I really respect him and go miss him.
Thank you, Charlie. Bob Crippen was a naval aviator and test pilot, and he actually flew the ultimate test flight, really, the very first space shuttle mission. Tell us about Walt.
Good morning. Dot, thank you for inviting us to participate in this celebration of Walt's life, a really good friend. Walt was actually my first boss when I came to join the astronaut office. I came off of a program, some of you know, that was a military manned in space program called the Manned Orbiting Laboratory, or MOLD for short, and it got canceled, and 7 of us got transferred over to the NASA astronaut office. And Walt at that time was head in the astronaut office of something called Apollo Applications Program, which later became Skylab. And unlike most people joining the astronaut office, since we just come off of a program, we were walked into the astronaut office and went to work. Some of us were assigned to Walt, which he was glad to have because he was the only one trying to follow the program at that time, so he was happy to have a few warm bodies. My recollection is that Dick Truly was assigned to cover the workshop. Bob Overmeyer was the multiple docking adapter, which was in St. Louis, and I was assigned to the Apollo telescope mount, which is mainly out of Huntsville. So we went in and started following those programs, but I hadn't been to work there at NASA for more than about 3 or 4 weeks when Walt called me in and he says, "Cripp, I got a job for you." And I said, "Okay, what is it?" And he says, "Well, they want to test out the Skylab potty. And they want to do it on a zero-G parabola on the KC-135 up in Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And your task is to go deliver a number 2 in one parabola, which is about 30 seconds. So being the new guy, you don't turn down a job. I said, "Aye, aye, sir." And away I went to Dayton, Ohio at Wright-Pat and met up with an engineer by the name of Bob Sherney and talked to him about what we were going to do the next day. And that morning I got up and had a big breakfast of steak and eggs. And I delivered on the first parabola. And I was happy to come home and tell Walt, mission accomplished.
That's great. That's great. Dr. Bernard Harris is a medical doctor and a spacewalker and flew multiple shuttle missions. Tell us about Walt.
Thank you for allowing me to be able to say a few words. I first met Walt when I was in middle school. And when I think about that, and I'm looking at my fellow colleagues here, I watched all of you guys, and you were my inspiration, and so was Walt. It wasn't until probably 20, 30 years later that I actually got to know Walt. And I got to know him through a mutual friend of ours, Jack Gill. And Jack and Dot and I used to, and Linda and Jack and Dot and I used to go to dinner. And a couple of things that I want to share with you. So one, I think everybody knows that Walt is a little bit opinionated. I think everybody's. And so at these dinners, we used to get into this debate about global warming. I don't know if you've ever had any debates with global warming. She's acknowledging that. And so I thought I had lined up my evidence for global warming. I was sharing with him, the experience of being on board the space shuttle and looking down and seeing the growth of the Sahara Desert, and I had it all lined up. And he says, "You're wrong." And I'm going to show you you're wrong. So at the next dinner, he comes and he has a pamphlet, and I don't know if you remember that, but he had like a folder with all this evidence against global warming, and also a pamphlet that I think that he jointly wrote. And I don't know if you guys know that Walt actually was a conservative radio talk host, and so he was used to debating, and so he wasn't going to lose this debate with me. So he actually presented it, and finally I just had to give in and say, "You're right. There is no global warming. This is going to go over forever." And I think we mutually agreed that climate change was probably a better way in which to do this. The next story I just want to share is, as an astronaut, you go through the training, you go through the missions, and there comes a time when you are ready to leave the office. And I was ready to leave the office, and I transitioned to going into business and going into venture capital. And you probably know, many of you in this room know that we are pretty competitive. So when I got out and I decided that I was going to, go into venture capital, I said, I could be the first to go into venture capital. Well, it turns out I wasn't. Walt started his venture capital firm in 1982, and he then became my mentor. So I owe him a lot. We spent a lot of time about investments, and there were a number of other astronauts, of course, that had left the astronaut office and gotten into business. And so if I was just to sum up my experience with Walt, is that he was a pioneer, he was an explorer, he was single-minded, and you know what I mean by that, single-minded, and I am truly blessed to have followed in his footsteps.
Amen. His directness was so refreshing, wasn't it? He told it like it was. Dr. Anna Fisher is a chemist and medical doctor, as well as the first mother to fly in space as a space shuttle astronaut. Tell us about Walt.
Thank you so much. It's a real honor to be able to talk about Walt, and thank you so much, Dot. My experience of getting to know Walt is a little different from most everyone up here. He had left the office, I think in 1971, and our class was selected in 78. So I never really had the opportunity to work with him in the office. But I got to know Walt and Dot over the years, just through the many things we shared, reunions, listening to briefings together, and listening to all the amazing questions that Walt would ask whenever there was a briefing that came up. And he was always asking just the right questions. And then later on, my partner Jack and I started going to Sylvia's Enchiladas, and we would run into Walt and Dot there all the time. And so our friendship really grew over margaritas and enchiladas and tacos and things. But one of the first times we were there, we're talking, and Walt is explaining how he is the world's best fighter pilot. And I'm sure there might be a few of you here who might disagree with that, but there was no convincing Walt of that. He was definitely the world's greatest. And I got to spend some time with him when we were traveling to Tucson, Arizona for the Nova Space Conference. And we just wound up being on several flights together over the years. But the one that I remember the most was we were sitting waiting for our flight, And somehow we got talking about T-38s, and he was talking about how hard he worked when they were working on the Apollo 7 flight, and how much time he spent away from home. And he and Wally were trying to make it back one night from Los Angeles, and he explained to me that they made it back in one hop from Los Angeles. And I looked at him and I said, that's impossible, because I know that when we were flying back from Kennedy, we were worried about going about 800 miles and certainly not 1,500. But Walt proceeded to explain to me how he and Wally very carefully analyzed their fuel, their tailwinds. As they got overhead El Paso, they decided to go ahead and commit to coming back. And he was describing to me as they turned final to land at Ellington how he had his hands on the ejection handles. But he wasn't about to say anything and disagree with Wally's decision, and they made it. So I will never forget that story as long as I live. And then after he told me that story, I bought his book and was reading. And if any of you haven't read his book, it is really amazing, his honesty. And I see so much in the astronaut office that I grew to know and love, in a lot of the same traditions and how things came to be. So I really appreciate your friendship, Dot, you and Walt. It's just been wonderful sharing all those memories together. I wish I'd had a chance to work with him. He sounds like he would have been a great boss, but I'm glad that it was better late than never to have a friendship with this amazing, very opinionated person, but who I really, truly admire. Thank you so much.
Randy Bresnik. And Randy, you had a lot in common with Walt. You're both colonels in the Marine Corps, fighter pilots, and raised in Southern California. Randy flew STS-129 and lived on station for over 5 months and is now working on future launch vehicles. Tell us a little bit about Walt.
Thanks, Melissa. It's great to be a part of a celebration of Walt's life, and I certainly sit up here as the junior member. I don't have 5 or 6 decades of Walt knowing him. It's basically in the last 2 decades that Rebecca and I got a chance to know Walt and Dot. And for us, there's no Walt without Dot, and no Dot without Walt. It was the two of them, and whether it was speaking together at Rotary events in Houston and around the area, or reunion events where we got a chance to meet and talk. Obviously, with the Marine fighter pilot background, we hit it right off right away. And I always appreciated hearing his perspective, not only just on space flight and where we had come, but from life in general. And Bernard mentioned being a mentor. Even with the separation in years between us, he was certainly a fountain of wisdom and knowledge, and I appreciate those discussions. And for anybody that knows Walt, Walt has one volume for laughter. And if Walt was laughing, everybody, you knew it. The room filled with his laughter, and I certainly always appreciated that. And when I think about, describing someone with an indomitable spirit, to me, that's kind of Walt. He knew what he, thought, he knew what he believed, he knew what he had done, and he was always very confident in that. And certainly that was something that was appreciated, I think, within the space agency, within business, amongst his friends. And, when you look at where he was Apollo 2 flight until we had the accident that we're going to commemorate here in a couple of days. And then he was on Apollo 7, the first flight after 3 of his friends, had died in that accident. The courage it took for that crew to get in there after we had, rebuilt the capsule and rededicated ourselves to accomplishing that mission by the end of the decade that George had mentioned. That took a lot, and certainly all of those who have ridden rockets understand that even a little more intimately. And I like to think that Walt's spirit certainly lives on, as we just had Artemis 1, the first uncrewed flight of the Artemis program. The very next flight, ideally in 2 years from now, we're going to put people on, just like we did with Apollo 7. And it's going to be, to take what Charlie said, it's going to be Apollo 7 and 8 combined, where we're putting people on the vehicle for the very first time, and we're not just keeping them low Earth orbit, we're sending them to the moon and back. And so all of that would not be possible with pioneers, without pioneers like Walt and his crew and everybody else that's come since then, continuing to push the boundaries and setting the example for all of us to follow. So Godspeed, Walt Cunningham.
I think that's a good place, that's a perfect place to pause as we take a break, and then we're going to start the next service at 11. But I wanted to read one of Walt's quotes, and it's really captured, I think, one of the themes of the celebration that we've had the last couple days. And Walt said, "Don't be one of those souls who says, if I only had to live my life over. Live your life in such a way that once is enough." And that's Walt. So thank you all for being here, and we'll continue the service in a few minutes.